emergency. It's as simple as that.
Senator from Virginia.
Madam President, I rise, as colleagues of mine have earlier today, to talk about the President's emergency declaration. Before I do, I will just say that this declaration deals with budgetary matters. At the end of the day, whether the President should be able to take $6.1 billion this year and possibly more in future years from the Pentagon's budget to deal with a non-budgetary emergency. And I just want to acknowledge that my budget staffer, my right hand on all federal budget matters for the last 6.5 years, Ron Storog, today is his last day, and I'm really going to miss him. So I'll start there. I'm really going to miss Ron, who's done such a good job. And my only good feeling about it is he's staying right here in the Senate and moving to work with the senior senator from Maryland. I want to talk about the declaration and urge my colleagues to vote to reject what I believe is the President's unwise use of his power to raid the Pentagon's budget. Is there an emergency at the border? There's a serious issue at the border, a whole series of serious issues, both negative but also positive. Trade happens across all the borders of the country. But all the testimony before the Armed Services Committee, where I sit, says there's no military emergency at the border. We heard testimony from General O'Shaughnessy, who is the commander of what we call NORTHCOM, everything in the Americas north of the Mexico's southern border. And General O'Shaughnessy said there's no military emergency at the border between the United States and Mexico. And we've heard the same testimony this morning from Defense Secretary Shanahan and the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford. So there's no military emergency at the border. And compared to other significant challenges that we deal with, 70,000 drug overdose deaths a year, climate change, 40,000 deaths a year from gun violence, including both homicides and suicide, homelessness, lack of medical care, military housing, it's hard to see why the border issue would be an emergency that would rise to the top of any list. I can certainly assert this: there are much higher priorities for Virginians. But while we could argue about whether it's an emergency, one thing I think is pretty clear: it's inarguably a presidential power grab. The President is unhappy with congressional appropriations for the border, so he's declaring an emergency to take $6.1 billion this year and possibly more in future years from the Pentagon's budget. And this will establish a very dangerous precedent. First, let's focus on the President being unhappy. For all of this President's tenure, up till the 3rd of January, he had 2 Republican houses. There were 2 Republican houses and a Republican president. Why should he be unhappy with the budget? He would have had the ability to convince Republican majorities to do what he wanted, but he could not. And so he is unhappy with what Congress, the appropriating branch, has put on the table. We put billions of dollars on the table for the border, but he's unhappy with it, and so now he's going to declare an emergency. It raises 2 important questions. Can a president just declare an emergency every time he's unhappy that Congress doesn't accept his budgetary proposals? And second, can the president use the declaration of a non-military emergency to just tap a spigot into the Pentagon's budget? Because that's exactly what President Trump is trying to do in this case. The President has declared an emergency that all agree is a non-military emergency. The President has said, I want to take $6.1 billion to deal with this emergency from the Pentagon's budget. He wants to take $3.6 billion from military construction. Military construction are the funds that we use to build facilities on our military bases across the United States and across the world, or to rebuild facilities like the air base at Fort Tyndall or big sections of Camp Lejeune that were hit in hurricanes last year. That's what the MilCon budget is supposed to do. I toured this morning, Madam President, Fort Belvoir to visit with Army families living on Fort Belvoir in Fairfax County, Virginia, who were sharing with me atrocious stories of the conditions of the housing that they're living in. Atrocious stories: rodent infestation, black mold, lead and asbestos. I drove by one military house on Fort Belvoir that had a big warning sign on the door: poison. Poison. You could not enter it because of efforts at asbestos and lead remediation. The families told me about the poor physical conditions of their properties. They told me about the fact that they couldn't get a response when they were trying to get help. And then they told me tragically about the illness of their children, hospitalizations, having to move out of their homes and apartments. One mother of a 10-year-old talked about the fact that her 10-year-old daughter, because of mold in her military housing unit, missed 45 days of school in the last school year. That's 1/4 of the school year that she had to be absent because of the poor physical conditions of military housing. The MILCON budget is there to deal with issues like this, and yet the president wants to take $3.5 billion out of the MILCON budget, $3.6 billion out of the MILCON budget. The president wants to take $2.5 billion out of drug interdiction budget within the Department of Defense. Press reports suggest that that account only has about $85 million available, so what they would need to do is cannibalize other accounts to fill up that account to $2.5 billion to take that. Those are the funds, important funds, military construction and drug interdiction that the president is proposing to raid. And I think it's important to notice this: the president's emergency declaration is not just about tapping the budget this year for $6.1 billion. Earlier today, I asked Secretary Shanahan in an Armed Services hearing, doesn't this emergency declaration last until the president declares it's over? If we don't rebut the emergency, it is not just fiscal year 19, it's fiscal year 20 or 21. It will enable the president to tap a spigot into the MILCON budget and draw out monies this year, next year, and in future years. So it's $6.1 billion that he's asking for this year. But unless Congress asserts its Article I power to say that, no, we're the appropriator, we're basically allowing the president to tap into this fund in perpetuity, thereby affecting important military construction priorities that would be good for the military families in our nation's defense. Which military construction projects might be compromised by the president's use of these dollars, this $6.1 billion? When the president declared the emergency, I wrote a letter to Secretary Shanahan on February 15th and said, can you give us the list of the projects that will be compromised by this $6.1 billion raid on the Pentagon's budget? And I have not received a response. That was 27 days ago. But this morning, Secretary Shanahan, before the committee, was asked, why haven't we received a list? If the president wants to take $6.1 billion out of the Pentagon's budget, give us a list of the potential projects that could be affected. I wrote a letter on the 15th. SASC staffers have been reaching out to the Pentagon. If you don't know precisely the projects, give us the universe, all unobligated MILCON projects that are on your priority list that could possibly be affected. Mr. President, today, Secretary Shanahan, after not responding to the requests, said, I'll send you a list at the end of the day. I'll send you a list basically after you vote this afternoon. The vote that we will be casting this afternoon is about whether the president should be able to raid the Pentagon's budget for $6.1 billion. We've been asking for a month what projects might be affected, and they are proposing now to give us an answer to the question after the vote. They've had the list from the very day we asked them. They keep a list every day about unobligated MILCON projects, but the service secretaries have not been allowed to share those lists with Congress until the Secretary of Defense allows them to, and he's going to allow us to see it today. Everybody is voting to cannibalize the Pentagon's budget to the tune of $6.1 billion. Every senator should be interested in what projects might be affected in their own states necessary to the nation's defense before they vote to give the president this power. In conclusion, Mr. President, I hope today we will stand up against the president's power grab. We shouldn't let the president tap a spigot into the Pentagon budget to deal with an emergency that all have agreed is a non-military emergency. We shouldn't let him tap a spigot that is not just for this budgetary year, but for future fiscal years as well, which is the effect of the vote today. We're the Article I branch, and under that section of the Constitution, we set spending priorities. The president should not be able to overturn the spending priorities that we have established in our appropriations bills because he's unhappy with our work product and raid the Pentagon's budget without telling us where the monies will come from. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Montana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to visit a little bit about the emergency declaration by the President, which is a bad idea. I think everybody in this body knows it's a bad idea, and we'll see how many people vote to override that bad idea. And it's a bad idea for a number of reasons. The President says it's for this country's safety, but he's robbing from our military to build a wall on the southern border, which I might add, most of the money that we allocated last fiscal year is still there, $1.3 billion, plus the $1.375 billion that was authorized by the conference committee, which was a group of Democrats and Republicans from the House and the Senate, passed by both bodies, which he received and said, I don't like it, and declared an emergency declaration. So, look, Montana is no stranger to military service. We are home to the second most veterans per capita of any state in the country. Every time our nation is at need, Montanans step up the plate and they answer the call to serve. And that is why today I rise to fight back against the President's declaration that we'll be shortchanging our troops in favor of a campaign promise to build a wall that he said Mexico would pay for. The President's plan to raid our military resources would directly hurt Montana's military community and its men and women that are in uniform. The heart of the Air Force's Global Strike Command is located in Great Falls, Montana, Malmstrom Air Force Base. The 341st Missile Wing at Malmstrom is a critical component in our nation's nuclear triad. It is a great deterrent against adversaries who would do us harm, and as President Kennedy said, it is our ace in the hole. Over the past few years, I've been fighting to secure the military construction dollars on the Appropriations Committee to meet the needs of Malmstrom Air Force Base. I led a bipartisan effort to deliver more than $19 million to construct a new tactical response alert facility. That facility was a top priority for Malmstrom because the current facility is old. It's laden with asbestos and lead paint, and it has complicated efforts to secure the base's missile sites. Also helped secure some $14.6 million for construction of a missile maintenance facility, missile maintenance dispatch facility. This facility will allow the base to more properly and efficiently store critical components and equipment for the missile field, and to retrofit its hangars so that we can ultimately house the replacement fleet for its Vietnam-era Hueys, which should be replaced in the next couple years. Unfortunately, these construction facilities, the construction of these and many others around the country are at risk by the President's decision. More alarmingly, Malmstrom is in critical need of a weapons generation facility, and I've been fighting for years to ensure that this project would be included among the Air Force's top military construction priorities. Earlier this week, just yesterday, the Secretary of the Air Force confirmed that the funding for the facility has been included in the FY 2020 Air Force budget request. This investment represents a significant step forward for Malmstrom and for the Air Force and for our national security. It's important because this is where ICBM warheads are maintained and stored. As a result of the deterioration of this facility, airmen and missileers must confront numerous safety and security challenges while carrying out their mission every day. But now, we have to tell them that this critical project, which the Air Force has said they desperately need, and which they do desperately need, could very well get kicked down the road and kicked down the list of priorities because the President would rather spend billions of the military construction money on construction of his wall. The same is true for other critical infrastructure investments at Malmstrom, including a new security forces compound. But the President doesn't care. He's more interested in robbing taxpayer funds to build an unnecessary wall on the southern border. Congress has rejected the President's request on a bipartisan basis, and his defiance of that rejection comes at the expense of my state's defense installations. Great Falls is also home to the Montana Air National Guard. My older brother was in the Air Guard for 35 years, and I have seen their work up close. Since we entered the Middle East conflict 17 years ago, this country has used the Guard like never before. They've asked a lot of our citizen soldiers and airmen, and they have always delivered. Whether that was deploying to war, fighting against wildfires, or saving families from natural disasters. In Montana, they have asked for little in return, but they have asked for the construction of a new aircraft apron to park and store the Guard's C-130 fleet. So once again, we got to work. We secured the money, $9 million, to make sure that our C-130s will stay in good shape for years to come. Max Baucus and I fought hard to bring those C-130s to Montana, and that is why I'm so outraged that the President's emergency declaration puts this funding at risk. I know that nobody in this body takes the decision of sending young men and women to war lightly, but when those difficult decisions are made, we better deploy them with the best and the safest equipment. The debate today is clear. A vote against the President's disaster declaration is a vote to protect our co-equal branches of government, our system of checks and balances, our Constitution. And a vote for the President's power grab is a vote for federal overreach and a violation of our oath of office. I hope my colleagues who vote for this plan are on the first plane back home to explain to their constituents why they're shirking their basic duties. Explain to communities, of which there are many like Great Falls, Montana, why they're ripping those investments out of their town and out of our military. And explain to our future leaders why it's okay to follow the Constitution only when it's expedient. This disaster declaration undermines the bipartisan work that Republicans and Democrats have done to rebuild our military. It sets a dangerous precedent that no doubt will be abused by future presidents. And everybody in this body knows that. We have an option here. We have the ability to stand with our troops, stand with the Constitution, and reject this declaration. It's critically important. If we're going to have a strong military, and I think we decided last Congress to make investments into our military that were much needed, and now the President's pulling those dollars out. It's nothing short of ridiculous. I yield the floor.
Madam President, when President Trump declared a national emergency over the crisis along our southern border, it was immediately met